Tom also has a background in humanitarian practice before going into academia, if I understand correctly, and also does work beyond the academic, has produced a short film series on humanitarian shelter that won various different awards. And today he'll be presenting on humility and autonomy, and apparently will take up my provocation from this morning that there is no deontological principle in humanitarian design. So we'll start with Tom's half an hour or so intervention, and then we'll open up with questions. But please join me first in giving him a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. As I'm sure you all know, next year it would have been a decade since that great summer of migration in 2015. And as you all know, it was a remarkable year, a summer when around 1.5 million refugees crossed into Europe, where asylum applications in Germany alone rose fourfold. And it was also a tragic year when it began when over 600 people drowned in the Mediterranean from just one boat. And that was the first of many disasters that really drove the media's story. Now, the research I'm going to talk about was set against the background of that event. It's about emergency shelter design. Because as refugees walked through the Balkan route into Western Europe, we kept seeing on the news how they found places to sleep as they went. Many bunked down under trees, hiding from police at the Serbian border. They put up tents in train stations like Kaleti and Budapest. And they constructed large informal settlements from waste wood and tarpaulin like the Canning jungle where this picture is taken. Many had to sleep in cities like under the railway tracks in Paris. And over the course of that summer, I, as well as many other people, noticed there was a remarkable uptick of interest amongst designers, pop architects, regarding this problem of shelter. Some of my friends at aid agencies spoke of all the shelter spam they were receiving, referring to the many unsolicited emails from well-meaning designers. There were people who thought they had found a solution to this vast new humanitarian need. In magazines and online articles, there were lots of interesting, often eye-catching ideas being sketched out. They included pop-up shelters that could be dropped from an aircraft, tents that transformed into clothing, shelters that stacked together like styrofoam cups so they could be transported more easily, and whole islands that could be reclaimed from the Mediterranean Sea to give refugees a home. Many of you may remember that in 2016, the Architecture Biennale in Venice featured very many of these ideas in its various exhibitions. So it was against this background that I launched a project in 2015 to look at emergency shelter design. It was called Architectures of Displacement, and as Jonathan kindly said, it led to this book, Fragments of Home, which is forthcoming with Stanford University Press. In this presentation, I want to pull out some of the conclusions from that book. And in particular, I want to argue that humanitarian shelter designs worked best in that year after 2015, 2016, when they were humble in their aims, simple in their execution, and most importantly, when they took the autonomy of refugees seriously. And this is the deontological principle that I want to propose to you. But before I say more about the research project, I just wanted to acknowledge that when I started, I was something of a skeptic about the value of humanitarian design. I had long suspected that it was more driven by the desire to show off innovative little tricks than it was to respond to real needs. And I outlined this in a couple of articles around a decade ago. One was called The Fetishism of Humanitarian Objects, and the other was called Humanitarian Neophilia. But despite this, my aim in this particular project was to try and understand ethnographically what drove the designers. What did they think the problem was that they were referring to? Why did they take the approaches that they did? And what did they think was successful when they unrolled a new shelter? So I raised some money and began a multi-sided study that ended up writing about 7 different shelters. And these are the 7 chapters in the final book. So in Jordan, I examined the construction of 2 massive refugee camps, Zatri and Azraq. In Lebanon, I studied how refugees had built their own homes, particularly in the Bekaa Valley, but also I looked at how they found rental accommodation. In Greece, I studied political activism and squats in particular, squats in Athens. In Germany, I focused on the adaptation of massive abandoned buildings. In France, I looked at a creative piece of so-called inflatable architecture. In Sweden, my interest was in the universal flat-packed home that was made by, funded, I should say, by the IKEA Foundation. And Vienna, I found a fascinating approach that focused on furniture, the small items that might populate a refugee shelter. And I'm going to talk about 4 of these examples today. I don't have time to go into the IKEA shelter, the squats in Greece, or the Lebanese situation. But as I said, I came into the project thinking that design couldn't really find a solution to this because it was a deeply political problem. It seemed to me that if you want to help refugees with shelter and protection, you have to engage with that underlying political predicament, because these snazzy shelters, they can't make the fundamental situation better, they can't help investment in lasting welfare for refugees, they don't help build the legal foundations to protect forced migrants, they can't counter the militarization of borders, in fact they often work alongside them, and of course they can't change public perceptions or discrimination. But I wonder if my view was slightly based on a misunderstanding of design and the role it can play. Because as I want to say today, I think it all depends on the scale. There is a space for design, a space where things begin to work, and I think the question is how we define it. So let me delve into the examples. And the first one I want to talk about was in Jordan, because it was here that I studied what might be considered the classical model of refugee shelter, which of course involved constructing huge refugee camps in remote areas. This is a picture of Azraq camp. And so Azraq and Zartri were the 2 main camps established both in very arid areas of Jordan. And they may not be what we think of as ideal design, but they are nevertheless a form of humanitarian design. They certainly follow a kind of logic. There are all sorts of reasons why governments prefer to set up camps. They help to centralize services, they relieve pressure on local schools and hospitals, and of course there were all those reasons of containment and control that we know so well. But there are also good reasons why humanitarians like camps. Even though they may say it's the last resort and they'd rather not set them up, they will very often do it because it makes providing relief much more straightforward. All the vulnerable people that you want to help are centralized in one place. They can be monitored, they can be checked, they can be assisted. And we all know that care and control has this very intimate relationship with each other. So camps remain a common response in the refugee regime. Like it or not, they are a form of humanitarian design. Now, the 2 camps in Jordan were laid out with tens of thousands of people living in so-called caravans, all made of metal, all lined up in a grid. Each block of the camp provided all the basic services and everything was planned in detail. It's an approach I call in the book shelter by metrics, because it was the logical conclusion of the many humanitarian handbooks out there that stipulate what people need, what their basic needs are, in absolutely precise detail. And this camp, Azraq, met all of these metrics. It had to provide 3.5 square meters of living space per person, an internal height of 2 meters in every shelter. The total area of the camp was based on 45 square meters per person. There were minimum distances to services like water points. Everything was set out in a metric, and everything was met. So amazingly, camps like this one were described by many humanitarians as model camps. But as you can see, there was no place for beauty. There was no vegetation. There was no color. There was no place for cultural life. All these homes stretched out in grey uniformity. And fundamentally, the problem here was one of control. People had all their physical needs met here, but they couldn't live the kind of life that they wanted. Of course, they needed permission to enter or leave the camp, but also they couldn't adapt their homes. So even though people tried to dig the earth around them to plant flowers, they were not permitted to have any foliage above a certain height, ostensibly on security grounds. And the camp manager famously said he wanted to preserve these huge vistas. He wanted to see from one end of the camp to the other. Now, this was precisely the point of this humanitarian design, and my interest was to get in the mind of the camp planners and to try and understand how they ended up with something that on the face of it seemed so completely inhuman. And it's an interesting story because the camp was created, in fact, in response to the perceived failings of the other camp in Jordan, Zatri camp, where humanitarians, the narrative went, had lost control. In Zatri camp, the refugees had reshaped the whole place. They'd painted their shelters. They had created gardens. They had moved their caravans into compounds in a square with an internal courtyard. They had decorated, they'd opened shops in many of them. And although many of the humanitarians that I spoke to saw the creativity involved here, they nevertheless kept expressing frustration that they couldn't track where people were. Now, I'm going to show a few short extracts from a film that I made during the course of this research. It was made with my colleague, Mark Breeze. And this first section I'm going to show reveals the perspectives of the planners who laid out the camps.
At night, they reshape all the caravans. And they reshape the caravan the way they want it. They make basically a U shape with 3 caravans, or they make a square shape with 4 caravans.
I think it was captured on video. It's extremely funny because you can see it from top that the house is moving basically, and it's actually a lot of people carrying that.
Imagine the reaction of our team coming the next day, where basically in this huge surface area, their either tent or caravan disappeared. And this has never stopped. And we have never been able to control this movement of caravan in Zatari.
People moved the caravans in a way that made a much more private space with an internal communal area where people can sit in the afternoons and enjoy social interaction without having to be out in the open, with some privacy.
The idea of Azrak was to basically repeat Zatari, but in a more controlled way.
The main experience in Zatari was the disorganization because people were just coming in large numbers and we weren't able to accommodate them properly or, let's say, plan their settlement in a sense. And we couldn't keep track of the movement of people inside the camp because people were actually moving their prefabs. In Azraq, it's a bit of a rigid grid, but basically the idea was to allow the people to have space for their own activities.
At night.
So there you go. I spent some time with this team of camp planners who saw themselves as responsible for the welfare of the refugees and for the material conditions of the camps. And the so-called lessons they took from Zatari was that they had lost control, and they wrote features into that new design of Azraq that meant, for example, that the shelters were fixed in the earth, they couldn't be moved, they had all sorts of rules and regulations. And although they had many features, as I said, that met the metrics, such as they provided electricity for every single camp, the camp was certainly missing something important. I'm going to show another short extract from a pair of designers also in Jordan who criticized the arrangements.
Azraq camp, a model camp, well designed, you see, and it's often described as a 5-star, but it's very far away. It's like an open air prison. It's supposed to be a place where you can live without any activity, you can survive there. From a human perspective, beyond relief and subsistence and food, etc., it's a disaster. It's boredom. Nobody wants to go there.
I think it's a formula that this has been the case and it works for years. Then we do the same thing. It's just a grid and they move ahead with it. So there is no need for public spaces, there is no accommodation for children, for elderly, for the streets, for the urban experience, nothing.
So this is a very common design, of course, and it shows us something important about the way that humanitarian design is often about trying to control certain situations. I have to hold the microphone. Now I'm going to move now to a second area of work, which was based in Germany and Austria. And this was an approach that was driven by the notion of adaptive reuse of existing buildings. So rather than constructing something new, the idea was to involve what was already there. And this was very much a feature of the response to the refugee protection crisis in Germany, the use of empty buildings. It actually extended also into Austria, but I'm going to talk about Germany first. In Berlin, in particular, many iconic buildings were requisitioned for use as refugee shelters. This included the former Stasi headquarters. It included the vast International Congress Center in West Berlin. And of course, it included the famous Nazi-built Tempelhof Airport. Now, many of these places had troubling historical resonances, as you can tell, but that's not necessarily what I want to focus on here. I want to focus on the design process, using Tempelhof as my example. Here we had several vast empty hangars being repurposed as a large dormitory. And it was a place where tens of thousands of asylum seekers found shelter during 2015 and 2016. So shower blocks were installed in these hangars, beds were moved in, and the refugees were housed in these bunks, separated by thin dividing walls. It was what I described in the book as a pragmatic approach to shelter. It managed to get people into a place where they had a roof over their head very fast. But of course, even though the intention was that they would only stay there for a few months, many stayed there for 1 year, 18 months, in some cases 2 years. In terms of design, there was not a great deal of thought that initially went into the creation of these places because it was an emergency and people were having to act so fast. And in the next clip, I talked to some of the people involved in the creation of the Tempelhof shelter who make it very clear that they were dealing with the most pragmatic considerations here.
And so we decided, okay, there is 7 empty hangars. We tried to build in refugee accommodation.
I remember when I first entered this hangar, I don't know, through this like massive metal door, and you just entered, and obviously it's huge because it's a garage for airplanes. And yeah, it's just like this massive industrial hall with very bad light.
We were running out of beds, and it was simply not possible to call anybody saying, well, would you sell us beds? How many do you need? 1,000.
So we have a big hangar with air conditions, pretty loud. And in those hangars, they bring up drywalls and put beds in it. And there is no roof on top. It's not closed. And there is no door. There's just blankets or something.
500 people in one room, no roof above them. You always had a noisy atmosphere there, even if people were not talking in a loud voice, but nearly whispering. But you always had this sound of many, many people doing whatever people do. We did work, we do have architects within our administration, of course. But we focus more on the questions around engineering. Will it work? How does it work? How much will it cost?
And so
this guy went on to say that the aim in design was not about building an architectural gem. That's the nature of humanitarian design in emergency conditions. It was about meeting basic requirements. But of course, the many issues within these shelters were that the place had to be carefully regulated. Again, it was a story of control. Everyone's day had to be structured in the same manner. There were fixed meal times. There were huge overhead lights that got turned on at the beginning of the day and off at the end of the day. Everyone was sharing this one big hangar, and there were no self-catering facilities, so everyone had to eat at the same time off canteens in an institutional kitchen. Over months and months, this kind of thing became extremely harmful for mental health, and I had a colleague who did a study of the mental health impacts of shelter in this case. People had no power to close a door, no power to stop the lights, no power to stop the noise. And of course, all the cultural and social importance of food was lost when you had to eat off canteen trays day after day for years. Now, I want to move to Austria now, because they had a very similar situation there, but a much more creative response from the design community. Many people were being housed in office blocks in Vienna, which were empty as a result of the financial crash and had never been refilled. Again, they were utterly soulless places, huge concrete monstrosities built often in the 60s and 70s. This is an example of one called Haus Erdberg. And they had all the same problems as Tempelhof: no light, no privacy, very controlling routines. You could hear everyone's business. But in this case, there were a group of architects who received funding in order to design some possible solutions to the problem. And they came up with an approach that one group described as social furniture. They worked with the inhabitants of the shelters to construct these very bright pieces of furniture, like cupboards and desks, kitchen cabinets, that not only brought some color into the drabness of the building, but also contained a very optimistic idea about what could be done in these transnational places. This item was the designer's favorite. It was called the Pot Commons. As you can see, it was a board that was mounted with pots and pans, and it allowed an area of the office to be turned into a kitchen. It was designed to show how objects can help people interact, not just to cook, but to collaborate with each other and to provide food for themselves. It was the essence of social furniture as an idea, that people would negotiate over the pots, they would use the yellow worktops, and they would cook for themselves. Another of these projects in Vienna involved buying parasols from a garden center and erecting them within the office blocks. They would use the umbrellas to create a more private space in a wider office. They suspended blankets around the edge of the parasols, which they clipped on with cable ties. And it was a very effective intervention because within these little parasol units, the noise that we were talking about became muffled. The light became filtered by the parasol above. You could turn on, everyone had an individual light within the parasol, which they could turn on and not disturb anyone else in the open plan office. And of course, in the daytime, you could draw the curtains and you could sleep. It was an extremely humble idea, if you think about it. They bought these things from garden centers and from hardware stores for very little money, and it involved just a little bit of thought. The architects also crafted plastic bottles into a doorbell, which meant that people actually had a door that others could knock on and ask if they had permission to enter, which was by far the biggest need, the biggest thing that people kept coming to say that they wanted, simply a door. Now, for the final example I want to discuss before concluding was based in France. And it returns us to some of the risks of humanitarian design, and in particular, the risk that the design itself can become something of a fetish. This design in Paris took the form of an inflatable bubble of bright yellow plastic, which was erected in a decaying railway yard in the north of the city. It was an extremely striking design. It was visible for miles around, and that, of course, was part of the point. You could see it from the motorway, you could see it from the trains coming into the Gare du Nord. And it was meant to stand as a symbol of hospitable Paris. I interviewed the mayor's architectural advisors who said they wanted it to be a signpost of humanity, an emblem of the city's compassionate intent. It was even meant to be a sign of hope and joy. One described it as being like a mother's womb. You can make of that what we will. But let's talk about what happened in practice. I'm going to show a quick clip of the architect explaining the aims. It shows us a little bit about the vision of the shelter.
They told me they want to do a humanitarian camp to host the refugees. They don't know how to do it. We are not in the middle of the desert. We are in Paris. How can we host comfortably in an ambitious way of doing it, because Paris is the city of human rights, it's in France, etc. At that moment, there was many people sleeping in the streets in Paris. So it's not only humanitarian, it's also taking care of the city, even security problems and hygiene problems. So I didn't have many choice. To do something in 1 month, 800 square meters, you have almost no choice. So not to hide it, this was the idea. More than to show it, the idea was more not to hide.
It's a place when you can have people for 3 or 4 days in order to rest, to make all the administrative process. And after that, we can have the time to dispatch them in other places, either in Paris or outside Paris. And it's like a platform for dispatching.
It's like a circus, you know, it's attractive for the eye, so wow, it's just not exceptional, but original. It's an original place, so just wow. But for the refugees, I think it's a lie, really a lie, because it's like a circus, you know, you can go inside with your baby and your child and you can see lion and clowns, but no, it's a fucking refugee camp. It could be the entrance of Disneyland, really. You just arrive, wow, okay, I'm in Disneyland, but no, it's refugee camp.
So, as you can see, the shelter was partly about displaying a kind of enlightened concern for suffering people. It was very humanitarian in that sense, but there was also the imperative to clean the streets, which was the concern of many Parisian voters. And the deputy mayor described how it functioned, and as you saw, he described it as a platform for dispatching migrants to other places. That was part of the official language. And the other person you saw at the end described it as a post box. Migrants were posted in and then carried off for delivery elsewhere, which I thought was an extremely vivid way of putting it. Because when you entered the doors into this place, you effectively made a pact with the local authorities. In return for a couple of weeks of comfort within the bubble, you agreed to give up your fingerprints, which were then tested against the European database, and it made you vulnerable to deportation. And at the very least, you would be sent off to a regional reception center. So it was a symbolic form of architecture that conveyed hospitality, but didn't really deliver it. And it was striking also that it became a logo. It appeared on many of the municipal holiday cards. And I thought that the fence that surrounded the center really encapsulated something about the design, because the designers wove colorful electrical tape through the fence in order to make it look a little bit, as they said to me, like Islamic lattice work. And the explicit aim was to make the fence feel less carceral. One designer said that she wanted it to be a kindly fence. And I think it really illustrates that tension and the dangers of humanitarian design here. Now, I'm going to bring things to a conclusion here, and I want to return to the title, Humility and Autonomy. Because I think that even though I didn't talk about all the case studies, there are 2 main lessons from this study into humanitarian shelter. First, humility, and I think that's relatively straightforward, because we've all seen how designs that don't overstate or exaggerate what they do often tend to be effective, those that don't fall into the trap of hubris. The problem is it helps fundraising if we make extravagant promises about what we do, and it's the best way to raise our profile. But very often the most successful humanitarian designs solve relatively well-defined issues. They're not flashy, which is why we never find ourselves talking about oral rehydration salts, for example. The great thing about those Viennese projects I talked about was that they had modest aims, and they involved buying or making a few simple objects. But the other, and I think the main point I want to make in order to conclude, is one about autonomy. Because I think this is a recurring theme in all the examples. The main problem kept being about control. It kept being about the problem of shelter being defined from the top down, and the people who lived in these shelters had very few opportunities to live the kind of life they wanted to lead, of course, but very little opportunities to actually control everyday matters, everyday conditions. In Jordan, it was obvious, but in places like Tempelhof, it was much more subtle. People had no control over basic things like light and food and noise. And in the case of the yellow bubble, of course, the control was being hidden behind this playful design.
Now, I think the alternative is that we take the principle of autonomy seriously. Now, I'm well aware that this is a liberal principle. You might even call it a neoliberal principle. But humanitarianism is nothing if not liberal in its aims and its motivations. It creates these spaces of liberalism in places around the world. Political philosophers have generally defined autonomy as the ability to shape our own life, even over small matters, rather than having directions imposed on us by other people. And the way I see it, there are two very important and useful things about autonomy as a principle for humanitarian design. The first is that it can be pursued in steps. Unlike freedom, which is filled with ideological baggage, and it's an all or nothing affair, the idea is that we can promote autonomy in small ways. And the second advantage is that autonomy is already rooted in the humanitarian worldview. It's a principle that is humanitarian through and through. It's based on respect for all people. It's about recognizing the equal moral standing. And we might even say that autonomy could save humanitarianism from itself, because it's a sector that, as many scholars have pointed out, is founded on this irony that although it's committed to the equal moral worth of all people, in reality it perpetuates that inequality. So it's possible that we can put it back into the heart of humanitarian action and produce these enclaves of control, places where people can act on their own terms. And I think that's important because, as we said, design can't change government policy. But as Peter Redfield has said, utopias often exist within a certain parameter. And the question is where we draw those parameters. Thanks very much.